Hey, it's Rob from Adulting. So, over the last couple of videos, I've talked about security, and I thought I'd tell you some stories. Sort of like, not so much inspirational, some of them are kind of funny, but just to sort of give those of you who are thinking about security a sort of hint of what the job can be like, usually in the most extreme situations. So, the first one I'll mention is a it was potentially a dangerous situation. So I used to work in this facility, and I'm not going to go into details about any of these past employers. None of them are my current employers. But again, I don't want to upset anyone with specifics, so it's going to be vague to a point. So I used to work for this facility. It was an old factory. It was a very very old factory. Like, catwalks were made of wood, and you know, creepy old building, and the building still ran on steam-based heating, which should give you an idea of how old it is. Like, no one does steam. These guys still did. Part of the problem with this factory, though, is they knew they were shutting down for a while, so a way to recoup costs and raise money and still make everything profitable is they sold part of their property to a modern factory. But the factory that the other guys were operating was still attached to the old factory. So it made things interesting when there was a problem that affected both businesses. One shutting down and laying off all their people, and then the other one is still in full swing and full operation. So I'd worked for this place for a year, and like the biggest thing that would happen is every once in a while we'd have a trespasser. And in especially old factories, there's a lot of ways to hurt yourselves. You can get lost. There's tunnels. There's basements. There's sub basements. There's 3, 4 floors where no one's been on them in 25 years, and so it's like, how safe is a floor that hasn't been walked on in 25 years? Locked doors, all sorts of stuff. And this property was about 1 million square feet of emptiness, but again, not truly empty. Like, a lot of the furniture, a lot of the equipment was still there, but a very ghostly feeling facility. And especially with steam, like the pipes would rattle, and every once in a while a random cat or a dog would find their way into the property. And when you're standing at one end of the factory and you're looking down 1.5 kilometers to the other side of the factory, and a shadow goes by, and you're like, and you're the only, well, you're there with another guard, but the other guard has to stay at the booth, to control the systems and stuff. So when you're the only person in the building, it's kind of creepy. So anyways, my very last shift, I'd put in my notice. I gave my 2 weeks notice. I was quitting. I was moving to a different city, starting a whole new chapter in my life. And nothing super serious had happened in the year that I worked there until this night. So I'm sitting at my booth, and my second guard, who's a junior guard, he's still learning the position. He comes back, and I'd noticed that there was this weird whistling sound. I was like, what the heck is that sound? I didn't recognize it. Now, I'm the kind of guy where I have to identify sounds, because sounds often they're often the first indicator something's wrong. Not just an alarm sound, but like creaking sounds or moaning sounds, whistling sounds. You're like, that's not normal. What is that? And you go identify it. It's one of my little techniques. And I was like, what the hell is that? Well, he comes running in, and he's like, hey, there's an alarm in building, I think it was 16 or something. I was like, what alarm? Well, as soon as he said that, all the alarms went off for the modern building and the factory. And everything's freaking out. It was as if it had timed literally for when he opens the door, the building starts shaking. I have no clue what's going on. To make matters worse, it's a holiday weekend. No one is answering the phone. Not to mention, because the factory was laying everyone off, the list, our emergency contact list, which really should have been updated all the time, wasn't getting updated all that often anymore. And so every other week, it was like, who's still on this list that we can call? Well, let me tell you, I called every number real fast. So a very long story short, the building is shaking. We think at this point it's a steam-based problem. And the junior guard's looking at me, the senior guard, and I'm not a supervisor, I'm just a senior guard. He's like, should we call 911? Like, what do we do? And I was like, I'm pretty sure we can't call 9. Like, we would have had, we thought it was serious enough, but I was like, that's not a me call kind of thing. Like, that's my boss needs to make that call. I couldn't get a hold of him. So then I started calling the emergency contact list. The overall boss of the factory, he wouldn't call. He wasn't answering the phone. I eventually found like this random manager guy that I'd met him like twice in the year that I was working there. He's like, what are you doing calling me? I was like, the building is literally shaking and every alarm in the place is freaking out. And he's like, what the hell are you talking about? He's like, that's impossible. And I was like, hey, my junior guard just went outside and he said the wall is literally moving. And so, long story short, I was like, you don't believe me? I held the phone up to like the air. I was like, here. And we had one of those old-fashioned phones with like the earpiece and the mouthpiece, and you're like, hello, one of these. And I was like, listen, and sure enough, you could hear the siren in the modern building just blaring. He's like, oh my god, that sounds pretty bad. And I was like, if you don't tell me what to do, I'm gonna call 911 and they can deal with it. And of course, that's huge, right? It's like bad publicity. No one wants that. So he does something. He shows up. It was a steam problem. And it's one of those things where it's like, I'm quitting. Like, the next day, I submit my reports, I turn in my uniform, and that's it. I'm gone, right? So I told the junior guard, I was like, why don't you go with that supervisor and learn what's going on, because you're still going to be working here. But, yeah, he showed up, and sure enough, it was one of these, I guess some sort of gasket had blown. But something in the mechanism that releases steam every few hours, or whatever amounts of time in the day, releases steam, it wasn't releasing, so he had to go find a secondary shutoff valve. Well, had he not picked up the phone and we'd call 911 and they'd said, hey, where's the secondary valve? I don't know. No, it was never in the training, it was never in anything. It was just like, good luck. So thankfully he knew what he was doing. He'd worked there for about 25 years. He knew where everything was, and thankfully he was the right guy to call. And nothing had really come about that situation. It was never in the news, nothing like that. So it was just one of those sort of funny things where it's like, one of the constants of security work is 99.9% of the time, nothing's going on. And then that 1% of the time, all hell breaks loose. And I find every time you think it's not going to happen to me, guess what? It's going to happen to you. And I find that to be usually the most common thing. So another story. So I'm in Toronto and I'm working a contract, and this is, again, it's a temporary contract, and there's a suspicious package. So I'm working as a supervisor and I go to relieve one of my guards, and all the guards should have the same training. I know the company I trained with, I trained as a supervisor for that company, but according to that company, all the guards have the same training, and suspicious packages, which is code for, a suspected bomb, because you have to treat a suspicious, I can have a hard time saying that word, suspicious package. The company's standpoint was to treat it as a possible explosive threat. So I go to relieve my guard. Well, the way this building was laid out is that this entrance was right on the side of a public sidewalk. So I get to his door, and there's this briefcase, rather large, like one of those 1980s style business briefcases, sitting there. And I was like, okay. And I tapped on the window, and he opens the door, and I'm like, hey, how you doing? And he's like, oh, I'm fine. I'm good. And I said, how long has this been here? Oh, about half an hour. I was like, did you not think to notify me or call me or, try to get some help? And unfortunately, he was all alone. He was in a part of this building where there was no one else for him to call. And I was actually coming out to give him batteries for his radio. And he said, well, my radio died and I can't leave my post, so I didn't know what to do about it. So I just left it. And I was like, okay, I guess you made the right call. Well, as we're sitting there, my supervisor comes around the corner. It was the end of his shift. He was going home. Well, I'm ex-military, and he's ex-military. And so he meets up and he's like, "What's going on?" I was like, "Well, this package." Well, as I say, "Hey, this package," like I'm mid sentence, it starts buzzing and shaking a little bit, and right away I was just like, and my supervisor, he was like, and so of course we're both thinking worst case scenario, like shit. I'm sorry, I shouldn't swear, but like we're like, oh my god, this is the worst. So like we're thinking like, do we call the bomb squad? Do we call the police? Like, what do we do? And so immediately, because you panic for about 10 seconds when something like that happens, you panic and it's just absolute terrifying. But you have to act, especially if you're the supervisor. If you don't make the right call, you're in trouble. But I've found that 9 times out of 10, a lot of supervisors are incapable of making a call. And I'd rather work for someone who's at least capable of making a call and then being able to live with the consequences of that call than someone who's not willing to even make an attempt at making the right call. Because a lot of guys are thinking about their careers and they're like, well, if I make the wrong call and I get blamed for something, I get fired or I get charged or whatever. But had that actually been an explosive device, let me tell you, the consequences would have been astronomical. It wasn't, but I digress. So after a few seconds of panic, I told him, I was like, all right, you get out of here. You're relieved for the next little bit. Just go. We'll take over. And, I was like, you see that police officer in the corner? Because this was an event, and so there happened to be some cops around. I was like, go get that officer. So he comes over. So the guard leaves, and the officer comes over. And we're like, hey, we got this package here, and it's buzzing and shaking. And, there was a brief about not calling the bomb squad because there had been a suspicious package a couple nights prior. And let me tell you that it was an expensive phone call that happened on another shift. And so we were hesitant to call the bomb squad because that was the procedure. But our company had basically freaked out about the previous false alarm call. And that the guy who came over, I think he was a sergeant, he was like, no, we're not calling. I have to confirm it's something. So we're sitting there and he just rips the bag open. He didn't tell us he was doing that. He just did it. And we're just like, so deep down, me and the guy that, us two ex-Army guys, we want to run because we're like, that's the dumbest thing he possibly could have done. It wasn't. And I thought that was really interesting because I've worked with the Toronto Police quite a bit. And it's probably because they deal with this kind of thing all the time that if they don't see some overt signs that it is a device of some sort, like if there's wires coming out of it or something, they'll treat it like it's a possible explosive device, but they're like, oh, it's a bag. And it's almost like there's no conscious thought about what it is you're opening, what it could be. And so we're like, it was almost a lesson on policing. It was like, okay, don't think necessarily the worst case scenario. In this case, it was one of those old fashioned alarm clocks with like the 2 bells and the round thing. It was one of those, and it had gone off. But it was just one of those funny stories of like a totally normal situation. But here was the best part. Once the officer, he looked at it and he was like, stupid thing, and he started cursing and he closed it. And turned out it was a guy who had walked into an LCBO across the street, a homeless guy. And he's like, I'm going to leave my briefcase here with all my possessions in it. And so when he came back, the officer yelled at him for about an hour. And afterwards, the officer came up to us. He was like, well, that was crazy. He was like, and I was just like, why did you do that? We didn't really talk about it after that. We did our reports and stuff and handed it in. But after that, it was like nothing. So just sort of like little funny stories like that. They're, not every single interaction is the worst case scenario, but it can be. And like I said, the moment you think nothing's going to happen, it usually does. Not every security job is the most exciting job. You never let your guard down. You can't let it down too much. But I might share some stories later on in the future. And, who knows? Like and subscribe if you want to comment or tell me how I can improve my channel. I'd love to, and maybe I'll see what I can do. So thank you very much, and have a good night. Goodbye.